Cool. It's like, wait, Gavin wants to get in. This mic next to me. Hopefully like this. The audio will be fine this time. Have like changed like the settings. I have spoke to IT for the past few days. I had like those issues with the Mac labs. First, that we didn't have the internet on Tuesday, and then on Thursday we had like other issues. But we solved the issue of the internet on Thursday morning. So like IT came up Thursday morning. I reported everything on Wednesday, and then I think they managed to install Adobe Premiere Pro, like where we're gonna edit it, your podcasts. So hopefully for the ones like with the assignments this afternoon, everything will be sorted, and that will make like lives easier and our work like more like streamlined. Last week, what I did was introduction to the module, but I went through a little bit on what was sport broadcasting, and then I talked about the different areas that we're gonna cover throughout the semester. So that was like last week. But if we pick the word sport broadcasting, maybe we spoke about broadcasting already. So what's media and what's like the idea of like spreading this symbolic content through different forms of communication or through different forms of technology. But I haven't spoken much about what's sport. So I like to go to definitions, and I like to break out things. So we have like the word broadcasting, and then we have the word sport. So maybe our next step now is like to understand what is a sport and what kind of sport we are talking about. And that's why this lecture I call like SportsMedia as a modern institution. So try to understand how both evolve together at the same time, at the same place. So how both are so interlinked that we call as a symbiotic relationship. So one needs the other to exist. That was like the question that I put on the activity last week that some of you have answered. So like which one needs the other the most? Is sport that needs media to exist, or is media that needs sport to exist? Or is that symbiotic, that both needs the other one to exist? Then I have like raised a question for this week's activity that some of you have already answered. I was like, what the characteristic of sport that makes it so compelling as a content for media? So as one of you have answered, it's like it's very hard to pinpoint one characteristic. So there's quite a few, like there are different authors showing different characteristics. Today I'm going to show some of them, like two different like theories. But it's up to you to decide. So as I said last week, and I mentioned in the seminar, you're level 5. You need to start like deciding for yourself. So maybe there's one there that you believe is the most important. Maybe it's because it's cost effective, or maybe it's because it's regularly played, and then every week there's something. Or maybe it's the drama. I don't know. It's up to you to decide which is the most important. Or maybe it's impossible to say that one is the most important. That we have various characteristics operating at the same time. So I like those quotes, and I like that book from Niklas Luhmann that I mentioned in the previous lecture already. And that's like, last week was page 1, now it's page 2. So like, kind of like his introduction is quite good to read and provides like lots of like food for thought. So what's like this mass media, or what is it about? So they are technologies. So we can think about all those different media technologies that we have. The telegraph, newspaper, TV, radio, as it put here in broadcasting, or like books, magazines, newspapers, and so on and so forth. And maybe you all have noticed what happened yesterday when Facebook got down and it got major disruptions on our way of lives. So for me, I couldn't speak to my parents back home in Brazil. I could speak to my sister here because I could send SMS, so like I had to go back to SMS, which I rarely use. Like to my brother, I couldn't speak. So how much that has changed? Like how much has those technologies become like so embedded in our lives? And not only in our lives, but like in sport in general. And it's the idea of disseminating communication. So disseminating those symbiotic, those symbolic content. So what I'm going to talk today is about sport and sportisation. So how some activities, or like pastime activities, became sport, or sport as we understand today as sport. Then some links between this form of sportisation to nationalism and globalization. So already like bringing some elements to what you need to discuss on your first podcast, which is nationalism and globalization, and their links to media. And those different forms of media, those different technologies, both old media, traditional media, or like analog media, which are like those newspapers, magazines, radio, like analog TV, but also digital media, new media, that are going to speak in 2 to 3 weeks' time. So what are the relationship between sport, nationalism, globalization, and media? And the last topic, the rise of sports media, or that symbiotic relationship that maybe is impossible to differentiate, and maybe it makes sense to call in one single word, sports media. So Maguire, on his book chapter that I put as essential reading, he starts kind of like the first sentence there, saying that possibly achievement sport, so like sport as an activity, which has an achievement, so you have a goal, so that maybe it's like scoring a goal, like scoring a try, beating your opposition, is now the dominant form of ludic body culture in the world. So sport, the way that we see, is like competitive. We don't see sport as cooperative, or just like for playing, or just for doing it. So that was like the whole discussion about those new sports coming to the Olympic Games. So is climbing a sport, or it became a sport to go to the Olympic Games? Or climbing is something that we just want to go outside on the outdoors and climb and have fun? Or maybe skateboarding, or surfing. How those activities became sport. How the rules were created so to mimic other sports that we know today. But when we have those dominant forms of sport, there are others that are forgotten. So there are other activities that we play, that we used to play, that we don't pay attention anymore. So who are the winners, who are the losers of those activities becoming dominant? And we can think this in a local level, but we can think globally. So like take Brazil, for example, we have like capoeira. So capoeira is a martial arts for some, others will say it's a dance, others will say it's a sport. But how capoeira exists within those sporting cultures? So you have like football competing against capoeira, you have like volleyball in Brazil, you have judo, which arguably is the best sport that we play in Brazil, because it's the sport that brought most Olympic medals. So that's quite interesting to think that judo is our best sport, and our second best sport is sailing. So it's not football. Well, maybe in the World Cup men's level, yes, it is football, but as an Olympic sport, it's judo, and then sailing. So to understand how like this very British thing, like football, like cricket, rugby, 2 forms of rugby, golf, probably like all sports playing on grass. How those sports become dominant across the world? Sports that were like created here, invented here. You have like lawn tennis as well, so like another sports played on grass. So to understand this, we need to understand globalization. We need to understand how England at that time, or like the British Empire at that time, was like so powerful and could spread those cultural elements. So people wanted to be British. So like local people, let's say in Brazil, in India, in Australia, they want to mimic what the British did because that was fashionable. Again, we have like some elements of culture and consumption here that existed since the late 1800s. But those other forms of sports, they still exist and they're still played. There's quite a nice Netflix series that people think, well, Netflix is not on sports, but Netflix is in sports. They just don't broadcast live sports. There are like so many documentaries on Netflix on sports. So the home games, there's like different sports that are still played. They're like very culturally embedded in some communities. So you have the Fiorentine culture. I don't know if you have ever saw Fiorentine culture, like played in Florence, in Italy. It's kind of like mass brawl, mixed rugby. People punch each other and then try to score goals. And it's quite big. It's played like once a year. And then it's like one of those episodes in this series. So it's quite nice to watch the series as a whole. So like how those sports they lost ground, but they still exist as non-dominant in those particular cultures. So as I mentioned, so like sport, it was a fashionable thing to do. To play tennis, to play golf, to play football, to play rugby, and so on and so forth, and it spread with the British Empire, formally and informally. So we have like two forms of spread. So like football spread more with like people working banks, like people that used to play at university, and they would go to Brazil, to South America, to India to set up businesses, and they would go and play and form those clubs. They were like social clubs, which they have something to do, which was sports. And the native upper classes, they wanted to mimic what the British did. So they would start playing football as well. They might start sending their sons, daughters, or probably son at that time, to come to England to study at university or college, and they will learn how to play those sports, and they will come back and spread football in Brazil, for instance. So lots of those sports were spread around the world in those ways. Sport as today marks clear distinction of power, class, prestige, or even gender. So if you go to Euclid, so I live in Euclid, there's still one club there that just accepts men as members. It's like a bowls club. So like women are not allowed inside that club. And you can see like how some clubs, like golf clubs, they did accept just men as well. In the past, I think it was like around London. Like people need to pay for access, so you have like class, you have like power, you have prestige. So what sport you play kind of represents who you are. But these hegemonic forms, like this dominant form, was not only passively received. They're like resistance, there are reactions. So people on those colonies or proto-colonies, like Brazil never been a British colony, it was like a proto-colony. So like Brazilians, they would try to beat the British because we want to beat the ones that invented that sport or that activity. So So how you bend the rules, and then you say like, oh, Brazilians dive. So well, maybe that's the way they found. So like to beat a very physical game. Or they start passing more the ball rather than dribbling. Or they start dribbling more because that was a passing game. So how people resisted the way of playing and created their own cultural way of reinterpreting that culture or that sport. So here are just like two images, like one to show how sport was played in the past. And here's like from the Brazilian Review, again like this newspaper that was in Brazil for the British expat community. And it's about cricket. So cricket was the first sport in Brazil. It wasn't football, it was cricket. So people play cricket in Brazil. Almost like no one plays cricket today. People play football. And it's funny as well, if you go to this newspaper and you read another, like, I don't know when, they say like, oh, football will never be popular in Brazil. It's too hot. It couldn't be more wrong. And it's funny that British media said the same thing when Brazil hosted the World Cup a few years ago. Brazil is too hot for football. Like, how like things that just are reinterpreted again and again and again. But this is like a cricket game. It's a cricket game between the whites and the N-word. I'm not going to say the N-word here, like I used to say, but like, that's not my word, it's the word that's written in this newspaper. So that's how they divide the two teams. And if you go to the names of the players, most likely the N-word team were British fourth generation born in South America. It's not about the skin color, it was about who you were. You're not a full British, because you're not born here. So again, it marks prestige, class, heritage, and so on and so forth. Sport became the battleground for nation states. So it's war without war. That's the way we think about sport. And the Olympic Games is the pinnacle of this. So it's where nation compete against nation. And until today, people say like, oh, why we have those plastic braids? I'm going to talk about this in nationalism in 2 weeks' time, or like 3 weeks' time. So like plastic braids. It's like athletes that were not born here, why they were competing for prison. And you have like so many examples of like athletes that were not born in their country, but compete from another country. Or like they're not born in that country that they compete for. And maybe that links to this second point. The amateur. You play because of the love of the game. So amateur from French, like love, so you play for the love and not for money. So you cannot go to another country and play for another country because your love is for where you're born. But again, that's very class and prestige thing to say. So that's how professionalism was banned here. But only amateurs will play. Because then you can save for just people that had the money and the access and the opportunity to play without getting paid. So the diffusion of this form of activity, of what we understand as sport, can be credited to two things that walks hand to hand. Nationalism and globalization. We have this idea that they are opposites, but they're not opposites. They happen together. They're parts of the same processes. So again, two examples from media. One, new media, Netflix, the English game. You can see like class, prestige, gender here. And then old media, this famous movie, Chariots of Fire. I don't know if anyone have you watched it already or not. You might remember from Mr. Bean, during the opening ceremony of the London, that he recreated that famous scene that is like running on the seafront. I cannot say the other words because it sounds like something else, different. So at the seafront, by the sand, like this famous image. So that's about nationalism. That's about globalization because they are training to go to the Olympics. I think it's Antwerp they're going. But it's about class and prestige because they're all Oxford and Cambridge students. And they're all men. So it's about gender as well. And as I said, Olympic Games is about globalization. It's where all the world has their attention to that place. But it's about nationalism. So like those opening ceremonies are an expression of the nation state. So they're trying to communicate something here. So we talk about China trying to communicate being a superpower during the Beijing Olympic Games. Talk about London 2012, but also Rio. So here we see like those two processes at the same time, globalization and nationalism. We have like this idea that the globalization erodes the power of the nation state, so kind of like remove those barriers. People can move everywhere, goods move everywhere, those symbolic content move everywhere. So now we can watch games from Italy, we can watch games from wherever we want. We're like watching cycling races in the weekend, that we're taking place in France, and so on and so forth. But it's very hard that this is what is actually happening. So it's not completely eroding the nation state. Nation state is so powerful to sport and to destroy communication and sport and nation, that it becomes part of branding. So we have the Indian Premier League. So the name says there, it's the Indian Premier League. You have the National Basketball Association, so national, as the name says, even though Canadian clubs play it. Then you have the Premier League, or the English Premier League, or the FA Premier League, even though that's Welsh teams play. So if like the nation state is being eroded, losing power, would you think that in the future we'll stop seeing the Olympic Games or any of those World Cups in any sport that you can imagine? Would you go like with just about money, like sponsor clubs or sponsor schemes? So here, just one example, maybe that links more to Paul's module before, like Martin Combs. So, where is the nation state here in this image? Yeah, but the nation state is always there. There's something that's like constant. The nation state. The line. Why the line?
English.
Yeah, the English line. So there's the English line. So the English Premier League. Even though the Welsh teams play, but there's no Welsh dragon here. Should be like a dragon here. Or is the English Premier League? Even though there's nowhere written English Premier League. It's like FA Premier League, it was the top, the first ones. Then it was the Barclays Premier League. And then it's just like the Premier League. But the lion is always there. It's always about the English Premier League. You can talk about place branding. So place branding is like really powerful. So Premier League, you associate with England. Football, you associate with Brazil. Right? Nothing. Well, maybe England, like where it was invented. But place branding is powerful. So there are some characteristics to modern sport. So one, secularism. So modern sport doesn't follow religious holidays anymore. So maybe in the past we have like those other forms of ludic activities. They were played on the solstice, on the equinox, like all those like pagan rituals and so on and so forth. Now sport has its own schedule. And that's part of like that podcast from Claire Balding. You know when summer starts or like finishes, but it's based on sports calendar. Technically, there is equality of opportunity, so like everyone can play. It's open to everyone. Like women can play, men can play, disabled people can play, able people can play. It's like very arguable. This point by Alan Goodman in 1978, even more if you read the second bullet point here, when first thing that I highlighted is that sport was devised by men and for men. So again, talking about cycling, what just happened this past weekend was the first ever Paris-Roubaix female. The men have been racing that race since 1886, 96, something like this. The women for the first time this year. So is a sport for men. So like Lizzie Dylan from Otley, just around here, the region, she just like won the first edition of the Paris-Roubaix, and she got paid 1,500 euros for winning that event. The Italian guy that won that event just got paid 35,000 euros. So why the pay is different? Why we have like much more attention to men's sports than women's sports? Maybe you have the origins of sports. It was a space for men, designed by men and for men. You have specialization, so like sport becomes more specialized, so like players have their own positions, they do only one thing. You got like American football is the primary example. You have like a quarterback, you have like one that just kicks the ball, doesn't do anything else. And you go on like basic football, like rugby, and so on and so forth. Like very hardly we had players that would move around now. Before they were like more non-specialized. Sports rationalized, all the scientific training, and now with all the metrics and all those media gadgets that we have that measure everything that we do. So sport is rationalized and sanctification. There's like this bureaucratic organization. So IOC, national governing bodies, local governing bodies, clubs, FIFA, same thing. So like very top-down, hierarchical, bureaucratic. It's about quantification. So everything is quantified. So like how far you jump, how high you jump, how fast you run. All the trainings becomes quantified. Quantification allows us for creating thousands and thousands of mini markets on betting companies, because you can like quantify anything nowadays. And the last one is the quest for records. So the idea that we have records, and those records compete against people today. I don't know if any one of you have, it's kind of confusing what I said, but like any one of you have played Mario Kart? Can you play Mario Kart? You know when you have the records, and you have like that goals that follow, and you play against you. So that's the idea. So let's say Usain Bolt is the fastest man on 100 meters. People that are running, in their mind, they have Usain Bolt as the ghost on Mario Kart. So the idea of quest for records. It stays, and then we compete against people that are already died or retired and so on and so forth. So that's modern sports. There are other characteristics that Maguire puts, but they're kind of like explain the same point. So like sensitization, rationalization, and so on and so forth. So that was like about modern sports. Before I go to a little bit more on the topic. Any questions so far? or what questions you have. You know that you can all put your questions as well on the slides on Thales Elevate. So people have already put questions there on the slides and have answered. So anytime you want to put questions, just like leave questions there. I will answer them. So the last topic for today is the rise of sports media. So I touched upon this topic a little bit last week. So how one becomes so important to the other. That's like hard for us to differentiate, or like hard for us to take them apart. So one needs the other to exist. So the appetite for sports, or for the content, sport as a content, goes way beyond what happens on film. So all the drama, all the build-up, all the commentaries after, all about like the personality of those athletes. So I was just like talking to Francesco. I don't know if one have met Francesco already. So Francesco's sister works for Adidas in Italy, and she was like doing a presentation for Juventus and things like this. So like how to reach the Chinese market. And we were thinking about like, well, maybe this new generation, they're much more interested about a particular athlete rather than Juventus as a club. So you have like this as an example with Ronaldo when he moved from Juventus to United and how many followers United got. So those personalities become central as well. So it's much larger. It's not only what happens on the pitch. It goes far beyond. So maybe what Juventus needs to do to reach that hard audience in China is to find a personality. Maybe find a personality that's not in football. Could be on something else. Could be on esports. And that you're going to spill over on football. And they will have interest for Juventus because of that personality. Sport as a content is used to reach a difficult audience. And difficult audience here is the younger audience. So how to get the attention of a younger audience? Especially men. So like that was like the theory, so maybe we can say like maybe women as well, I don't know. But that was when it was written to especially men. How to get men's attention through, let's say, newspaper. Make them consumers of newspaper, consumers of news. So when I started reading newspaper, when I was like 10, 12, I started from the back. So like Brazilian newspapers, the back is sports. So I rather than start reading from the front, which is like politics, economics, police, like crime, and then sport, I started from the back. So I read football, because that's what's so many news in Brazil. Football, and I go crime, and so I went from the back. So to some extent I got hooked to newspapers because of sport. So you can use that content to attract those difficult audiences. So it's like hard to differentiate between the two during the last 2 years because one needs the other so much. People said, well, if it wasn't because of the media, sport wouldn't have that global reach. Maybe you can like think the opposite way. If it wasn't for sport, people wouldn't be buying newspapers or wouldn't be like signing TV. So I had like just changed my deal with BT Sports, or BT in general, because I was losing Eurosport. And to have Eurosport, I had to sign Sky Sports. I don't care about Sky Sports, but I had to put this on my deal. So like another 10 quid per month to have Sky Sports. No, actually to have like Eurosports. And then a lot of channels that I don't even want. So you use sport to get people into consuming your media channels. So just 2 examples here about how it's beyond what happens on the field. That's like Rafael Silva, judo player for Brazil. 2012 in London, she was like tipped to be gold medalist or like at least getting a medal. First fight, she did an illegal move. She grabbed the leg of the opponent that was banned for the first time in the Olympics, and she got disqualified first fight. She got like lots of racist abuse, really bad. She was like quite young. Then 4 years later in Rio, she's from one of the favelas in Rio, and she goes and wins the gold medal. And it's like the whole story is about where she comes from. So like Cidade de Deus is the favela that she grew up. So there's like this famous like Brazilian movie, now I forgot like the name. It's not Elite Squad, the other one that happens in Cidade de Deus. Things like God City maybe in English. It's quite nice to watch. So it's beyond what happened on film. So maybe if you want to check the significance of media, and that like people like said, the global reach, maybe you can look at just any of those mega events, like the Olympics, maybe the FIFA World Cup, men's or women's, and check the overall audience. So in a stadium, you can fit what? 60,000, 80,000? How many are watching through the media, on TV? Nowadays, mobile, streaming, maybe reading newspapers, following on Twitter, and so on and so forth. You get billions and billions. So media becomes indispensable for sports. But for sport to have this global reach, it needs to have a local meaning. So sport needs to be localized. Those stories need to be localized. It cannot be like something that's just global, happening really far from what we care about. So if you watch the Olympic Games here, it's completely different from watching the Olympic Games in Brazil, even though it's the same Olympic Games. Because here, what they're going to show are events that the British want, the British like, the British had chance of winning a gold medal or a medal in general. And the same thing in Brazil, and it will be similar across the world. So we have like one massive event that is very localized in the way it is mediatized. So here, just like one example from the FIFA Men's World Cup in Brazil. Around 1 billion people have watched that final for at least 60 seconds. And if you put in perspective, I was looking because I just like wrote this chapter about digital media and FIFA World Cup. The FIFA YouTube channel has a total of 3 billion views of all those videos since what, 2012, I think they have that channel. Just like this game, 1 billion. So you might think like, wow, new media is disrupting this traditional way of consuming. It's not that much. So we still consume mostly sport, live sport, through TV. YouTube is another available media for us to consume sport. That's the example of sport being localized. So that's like FIFA Men's World Cup in Russia. It was like one of the games. I can't remember which game it was. So that's like a Twitter network. And I got the tweets relating to the media companies broadcasting that game. So in Brazil was Globo and Sport TV, here was the BBC. And those colors represent the language. So you can see that people talk to the media of their own countries. So again, like goes to that point. It's a global and local. Nationalism is important. So the language is important. So Brazilians in pink, they're like talking to Globo, Sport TV, and so on and so forth. You have like people speaking English here, BBC, you have like Spanish here, French on the top there. So, global event, but localized at the same time. We can think that TV is the medium, as I just mentioned before, but Bellamy says that maybe magazines are the best barometer, like the best way to measure what is popular. So what's in the print media, especially magazines, is what is important for popular culture. An example that I brought before as well about like my case with BT and then Sky. We can think that sport as a content was used to drive sales or adoption of technologies. So it was done with radio, and I'm going to speak more about this next week. It was done with radio in the US, but it was done here with Sky. So when the Premier League started in '92, Sky had no rights. So for you to watch the Premier League, you had to sign Sky. And you get like that huge package of channels that you don't want. So technology adoption, or media adoption, or maybe bundle adoption, or product adoption. So there are some characteristics that make sports and content so ideal for media. So like attracts large crowds, people are really interested. It's hard to find someone that doesn't care about sport. Is easily translatable to other cultures, so the rules are easy to understand. It's very cheap to produce compared to other types of content. There's like drama, like real drama, real people, as I just showed with like Rafaela Silva, the judo player from Brazil. So she has a real story, she has a real background, not a character invented by anyone. She didn't do it on purpose to lose the fight in London and then win in Rio, that's her hometown. So there's like real stories there. And that's what gets us like really passionate about sports. There are other characteristics if you go to Steve Jackson's paper in relation to sport as a content. I just like pick those ones. So here is an example. You know like what this guy is? Yeah. So that's Ninja, like e-gamer. Possibly not the best gamer, but maybe the best streamer. And it was like the first e-gamer to feature as ESPN magazine. So it goes back to that point, like what is sport? So we talk about sport and think about modern sport, like football, rugby, and so on and so forth. But is e-gaming a sport now? That's something that's becoming normal to us. You had in the Olympics, now in Tokyo, the Olympic virtual series. That were e-gaming. Not like Fortnite, but they had like cycling, they were like racing, like car racing, all virtually. They had like other ones that I cannot remember. I feel like rowing as well was there. So maybe e-gaming is becoming a sport. You have like the Asian Games, they had some e-games, more like what we understand by esports. Or like e-gaming. Or like esports, we talk about the other one. So like, what's the definition at the end of the day? What's what? So to finalize the lecture, there's like just a few slides left. Here there are like other characteristics that make sport so compelling as a content for media. So the first one is the reality factor. Very similar to what Jackson mentioned about real people, real drama, real stories. So it's played by people. That's Rafaela Silva here crying when she got the gold medal in Rio. Real story. Couldn't like script that. And no one will think about this as a script. So unscripted. So is WWE a sport? Some will say yes. Some will say it's more entertaining, more like a soap opera. Because it's more script. But you can bet on the WWE. Can you? I think you can. So it's not unpredictable, it's predictable. Well, someone knows what's going to happen. because we're already recorded. Or it's live. I don't know. No. Never watched WWE. Sorry? Oh, yeah. The other one, again, translatable to other cultures. The other author calls the international literacy factor. So those rules are quite easy to understand and are quite easy to spread around the world. So this is like a 50 pence coin from the London 2012. So I like to collect coins. That's one of the coins that I got the first from that 2012 Olympic Games. Explaining the offside rules. Maybe it's like the hardest rule to understand in football, but it was like made as a coin. So it's that easy that it can be explained through a coin. So that's an example of media. So you might not think that the coin is a mediated thing, but it is. So sports happen regularly and it's cost effective to produce. So here, like COVID provides like a really good example of like how it stopped that regularity. We didn't have like live sports anymore. So what media did, how they fill that gap, how they fill that void with no sport show, like no live sport show. There is a loyalty and effects factor in the sense that people are willing to consume ancillary products. So other products associated with that sport. So again, one example here that relates to Francesco, massive Juventus fan. I'm pretty sure he watched that Netflix documentary on Juventus. I did not, I didn't care. But people that are interested in Juventus would go and watch that. Or maybe people that are interested in Sunderland, they'll go and watch the Sunderland documentary on Netflix. So again, you're so loyal to that form of content that you're willing to consume other products. I could have brought the example of FIFA. People love football, they play FIFA. Or like Pro Evolution. Or like Football Manager and so on and so forth. So like there are so many other products that we consume because we like football. Or we are trained to like football. Then the denying factor is very hard to find someone that hates sports. I used to live with an Italian friend. She hates sports. So I was like watching sports. She would just like go to her bedroom. We would like share a flat together. She hated sports. She was like, despised sports. She was like completely against professional sports. But I think this was the only person that I know that hated sports. So, large crowds, and people love it. Then, I think that's the last one, the Z-proof factor. We are so used for advertising to be there that we don't even bother that they are there. And if you want to consume that content, we need to be exposed to those ads. So we have like the background here with the women's FIFA World Cup. If you want to listen to her interview post-match, you need to be exposed to all those ads. There's nothing you can do. You cannot change the channel. Well, you can like close your eyes and just listen. But it's there. If you go to cycling, it's all the time. You can think those cyclists as human banners. Their shirts are all ads. You have like their bikes, what commentators said about bikes, about sponsors. And you have like even, that's like EF education first now, or like the track, I don't even know what's the name of the, that world tour team. But they did like a new kit and they said that it was like the most compliant kit to the UCI rules. So UCI has the rules, how big the sponsors can be, and they did the most compliant one because they even put like the size. So they had like centimeters measured here and everything like that. So if you want to watch cycling, you'll be exposed to branding and advertising all the time. Oh, there's like two last ones. Promotion factor. So, as I mentioned before, you use sport as a content to drive adoption of technology, of bundles, and you can use for branding, as BT does there, calling themselves the new home of the Champions League. So if you want to watch the Champions League, you need to sign BT. So there's this promotion factor. And the last one is the integration factor. So we talk about convergence media. So things are converging, economic convergence. So the IOC owns OBS, the Olympic Broadcasting System. So they generate all the images that we see on the Olympic Games and the Paralympic Games. So the Paralympic Games, IPC, the International Paralympic Committee, they have a partnership with OBS to use OBS expertise, equipment, and so on and so forth to generate the image that we all watch around the world. But the IOC has also the Olympic channel, so they have their own channel. How many football clubs have their own channels in multiple different platforms? You can think of Twitter as a platform to have a channel, YouTube, Facebook, so on and so forth. So they become part of the communication entertainment industry. There's like a very powerful interview with, I think it was former Liverpool CEO, that is saying that he sees the competitors from Liverpool. It's not like Manchester City, it's not United. It's actually Netflix. It's Fortnite. Those are the competitors for Liverpool. Because you are in the entertainment industry. It's not only football. You're like communicating some information, some content, that you are competing for that attention. So they are in the entertainment industry. And that's what I had planned for today. In the seminars, we're going to start properly working on the first podcast. Now we have like more information, like more theories to work on and plan what you're going to do. And then we can see if like Adobe Premiere Pro install, and then we can like play around a little bit and I can show you how to do things, even though we don't need now. Last thing, I mentioned that we have the enrichment week on week 8, I think. So what I did, I just emailed John on the TV studio in town, and I managed to book, I think like 6 hours in that week that we can use. So like Tuesday and Thursday, like 3 hours each day. So people have like to sign in, but we can talk more about this. So you can go and record your podcast on the TV studio in town. Cool. So see you all in seminars or on Thales Elevate or Thales Elevate, and next week here in the lecture.